Good morning. This is our presentation on independent and dependent variables. So I'm going to go through it quickly because I think I have a 5-minute limit on Screencastify. The easiest way to understand how variables tie into scientific investigations is to use math. So if you can do the math problem 1 + 1 = 2, then you are ready to learn about variables. So here's a problem. 2 + what equals what? What does the problem equal? Well, that depends on what number you put in there. So if I put in a 2, my answer is 4. If I put in a 4, my answer is 6. If I put in a 50, my answer is 52. And so in every example, we changed one number, and it affected the answer. So the answer depended on what we changed. It is very simple, but if we try it here, we could do 10 + 5 is 15, 10 + 20 is 30, 10 + 100 is 110, and so on. So what does that have to do with science? Variables are used in both math and science, and variable comes from the word vary. Able means it can be, so a variable is just something that can change. So in our math problems, numbers that change are called variables. And then a control is something that doesn't change, and it's going to be exactly the same in science. In science, we use independent variables, which is the one thing that we change, dependent variables, which is whatever it is we're measuring, and then controlled variables is everything else. So we change one, we measure one, and we keep everything else the same. And if you do that, you get a good outcome with your science. So in math, that means the number we didn't change is the control. The one we did change is the independent, and the one we measured, or the result, is the dependent. So you can go ahead and write these notes in your notebook. You're going to need some definitions. You do not have to copy all the words on the screen. You probably just want to say controlled are things we keep the same. Notice the words in red. They're the same. They don't change. The scientist controls them. You get a fair outcome. And remember, you can pause the video at any time to write things down. The way we remember that is class. Controls always stay the same. The independent variable can also be called a manipulated variable. It's the one we change on purpose. We only do one. It's the difference between the groups. It's why things change. And if time is part of your experiment, time is always the independent variable. We remember that by saying ICHOP, independent change on purpose, because that's the one we deliberately change. Dependent can also be called responding, and it responds to whatever we changed. So it's the effect. It's what we observe, measure, or what data we collect. So if you're writing something down, that's probably your dependent variable. You remember that by DRUM, depends on results you measure. So with a science experiment, you want to make sure you only change one thing. So if we're testing plant food, for instance, we would keep all these things the same. The independent variable would be our different brands of plant food. And then the dependent variable of what we would measure will be how much the plants grew. How tall did they get? The controls, and so the way this ties back to math is control variables plus independent variables equals dependent variables. So this is just an example of that. And this is another way to look at it, more like a math problem. Keep everything the same except for one thing. Change the one thing, you're going to get a result. So if you can do 1 + 1 = 2, you can do controls plus independent equals dependent.